Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Well, Ken Sensei, I know you are very much interested in the theater. I've seen you perform at TIP, for instance, and very much enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Hiromi-san. As I've mentioned, I think, several times before, you know, there was a time in my life when I thought of going on the stage.
Yes, but I suppose in your case, you were thinking of the Western theater. But as you know, we have also a long tradition of performing art in Japan,
Of course.
such as kabuki, bunraku, and no. And they are very well known abroad too, aren't they?
Yes, indeed, and particularly in recent times, kabuki troupes and companies and no have been heading off all over the world, haven't they? I have a friend in London who's particularly interested in no.
Is that right?
He's forever instructing me about it. He told me, for instance, that there was a French ambassador in Japan, Paul Claudel, who was a poet and a critic, and he introduced no to France. Then Ezra Pound, he introduced no to William Butler Yeats, and, you know, the Irish poet and playwright. And he was influenced by no, and he wrote a play called At the Hawk's Well.
Ah, yes, I've heard about that play because it's translated into Japanese and produced here also.
Yes, yes, indeed. Well, I understand that it was very favorably received, and recently this play was presented again in English, created quite a stir. So today we've invited a gentleman who was very much connected with that production, Mr. Richard Emmert. And, of course, Richard is very, very interested in no, and knows a great deal about it. So thank you very much, Richard, for coming along today.
Thank you very much.
Very nice to see you.
Yes, I'm particularly glad to be able to see you, Rick, because a friend of mine told me about you. He attended a symposium, international symposium, sponsored by Hosei University, and it was about no.
Yes.
And he told me about you. But if we have time, we might talk about it a little bit. But at this point, I would like to ask you about your background, like where you were born.
Well, I was born in Ohio, in the United States, in a small town of about 3,000 people.
Ah, yes.
And then I went to college in Indiana at a small college, also a small college, Earlham College.
What did you study there?
And there I majored in history and Japanese language, but of course I did a lot of theater and music at the same time.
Now, they were in the middle of Ohio, Indiana, a long way from Japan. Can you tell us briefly what the Japanese connection was?
Well, in fact, when I was in junior high school, a Japanese girl sent a letter to a newspaper which my family receives, and she wanted to come and study in the United States, and we said we would gladly support her, and so she came and lived with our family for a year. And after that, my parents also came to Japan several times, so I was always, there was something I had a certain interest in.
So when did you get to Japan yourself the first
I first came to Japan when I was a junior, when I was in my third year of college at Earlham College, and I was a student for 1 year at the International Division of Waseda University.
And then what happened after that?
And then I went back and graduated from college and came again in 1973. And from 1974, I entered Tokyo University of Fine Arts and Music, Geidai, and began to study mainly about Asian music. And at that time, I became interested in no.
And scholastically, what are you up to
I
at the moment?
finished a master's degree at Geidai, and now I am in a doctoral program and intend to write a doctoral dissertation on on the music of no drama, particularly looking at some of the differences between schools of no.
That's very interesting. Well, we may be able to ask you in some more detail about that later on. But anyway, now, can you describe what the fascination is of no? Komi-san,
well, I must admit I don't go to see no very often, perhaps once a year on the average. But in my case, I find the costume very attractive, and also I love the simplicity of the no stage. It's so austere and it's so beautiful. But in your case, what is it that fascinates you?
Well, I think there are a lot of people, and I should say include most Japanese, who would, for those very same reasons, not like No, because it's austere and it's simple. But I think there are some misconceptions about what No is, and that it may be very quiet and very still, supposedly, on the surface. But in fact, below the surface, I think there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of energy being produced on a No stage and being given off on a No stage. There's a lot of dynamic movement taking place.
Now, the average foreigner, I must say, goes in and I think thinks nothing is going on, and everything is very slow, and of course they can't understand a word of what is being said. Perhaps they appreciate the music, but what would the appeal be to a foreigner, Rick?
Well, I think the expectation can't be the same as what you would expect from a Western play, where a story is very important. The story is everything. In No, the stories are rather simple, but there's a whole combination of a number of different elements: the music and the dance, and the costumes, and the movement, and these elements combine, and the stories themselves are very simple, but I also think very universal, perhaps, say, compared to kabuki, where kabuki tends to be much more Japanese cultural bound. I think No stories in their presentation, in their presentational format, are very Japanese, but the themes themselves have a certain universality to them.
Well, isn't this a characteristic that the works of all great writers have? Say, Shakespeare. He certainly has a universal appeal, and even the Greek tragedies,
certainly,
which can still be presented today, can't they?
They're produced here too. Yes, that's very much so. Well, slightly changing the subject, I suppose I'm writing in saying that your first interest in No was music, was it?
Well, I first started taking lessons in both dance and singing. And, of course, the fact that I've done a lot in music beforehand, I was very interested in that musical aspect of it.
And is that because the immediate appeal of music is more understandable?
Probably it is for myself. I think maybe the immediate, for myself, the immediate appeal of music is more understandable. Because that's the way I look at
Japanese music.
Whether that's true for everyone who would see it, I'm not sure.
Well, what about, sorry.
No, I was interested in, with your knowledge, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the music itself, because I don't know much about it.
Well, it's difficult to sort of isolate one element, that is the element of music, isolated from No, because, as I said before, there's so many different elements in No. There's the dance, and there's the dance movement, there are the costumes, there's that stage, that sort of aesthetic, sort of visual quality too. And then there's, part of the music, there's the singing and what have you. But as part of the music, I think...
What about the actual instruments?
There are 4 musical instruments, a flute and 3 drums, and they sort of they're very responsible for carrying that sort of energy flow through the play. I think they're very responsible for giving that energy to another.
Well, now you are a musician amongst many of your other talents, and you know a lot about the actual instruments used in No drama, so I presume you can play some of them.
Yes, indeed, and surprisingly enough, I brought my flute today. This is a No flute, I think the no flute itself is extremely, in itself, very Japanese, and in the sense that it is a very unique flute.
Is it difficult to learn, may I ask?
If you've played flute a little bit beforehand, it's not so difficult. But there are many people who can play flute and people who can't. But it's considered difficult.
And what are you going to play for us?
Well, I'm going to play a entrance music for a piece of entrance music called Ⅲ. And it's very short and very lively.
Certainly, it's very lively, isn't it?
Yes.
Quite changes my ideas about no, that one little piece.
Well, it's a piece which, of course, is not used in all no plays, but it is used in a number of different no plays. More of the more exciting,
Yes, one
plays.
can visualize them coming onto the stage to that. Well, of course, as you said before, we can't really separate the elements of no, but we are trying. And obviously, if we talk about music separately, we must at the same time talk about the other aspects. For example, the dancing and the acting. Now, I take it, Rick, that you're also a dancer and an actor, are you?
Yes, I would consider my main sort of interest right now mainly in the music, but I've also done a lot of movement in regards to no from the very beginning. And I've danced on the stage a number of times, just shimai, and also I've danced a full no play in full costume.
Do you have to try and totally set aside your concept of Western acting? Do you have to purge your mind of the sort of extrovert, outgoing type of acting?
I don't think you have to purge your mind of that. Of course, it's not the same, but it's like speaking two languages. It's like speaking Japanese and English. When I speak Japanese, I don't necessarily purge my mind of English. I think, though, in fact, they are two different things, and they have to be dealt with differently. And in fact, no is very earth-centered, and you can't have movement which is sort of outward, sort of thrusting outward, which seems to be more characteristic of ballet and sort of moving outward, but no, it's very...
I've often thought it must be awfully restricting to have to wear a mask all the time. It's a silly question, perhaps, but is it?
It certainly is, and that is one of the reasons why, with a mask, a dancer can't be jumping up and down all over the stage, obviously.
Well, of course, another aspect about no is its poetry.
Yes, well, that's entirely good.
And we cannot forget the names of Kanami, Zeami in discussing no, because these are very important people in the history of no. And lots of no scripts are written in the language of their period. And even to Japanese people, we certainly can't understand everything about it without some study. So, in your case, what do you think in no that probably transcends time and nationality and things like that?
And language. Well, I think we have to approach no, or going to a performance of no, differently than you would approach a Western play. A Western play, as I mentioned before, it depends very much on the story and the storyline.
Yes, no matter how good the acting is, it hasn't got a good story.
It falls. And I think with no, you have to approach as a total whole, and the story may be rather simple, but there's the poetry and there's the expression of that simple story. A poem can be very simple too in English, but it's that use of words which is very important. Then, of course, the other elements which I mentioned before, the costumes and the mask and the stage itself, and the music, the singing, and all of it becomes almost like a poem on stage, a visual poem.
Yeah.
No, I was wondering if it's comparable to, say, Italian opera. Even though you don't understand the language, you can still enjoy the costume, music, acting.
Perhaps it is, but I think with Italian opera, there's much more of an emphasis on that sort of operatic, the vocal and the musical aspect of it, where perhaps with No, there's more. Not just that, it's a more unified, it has to be taken as a total, and you can separate the elements, and there's something a very interesting and aesthetic quality about, and you can appreciate those separate elements, but the total is always greater than its individual parts.
Well, I wonder, so many, I mean, I'm always talking from the foreign point of view, so many foreigners are really frightened of going to No because they think they're going to be bored and they think it's just all beyond them. Now, is there any advice you'd give to a prospective No goer?
Well, as perhaps I suggested before, I think you have to throw away those conceptions of going and seeing a story being produced realistically before your eyes, and it's sort of this feeling of much more of a feeling of looking visually at sort of a poem and looking at these various elements, and then feeling underneath this energy and this sort of dynamic quality which is taking place, even in something which on the surface seems very slow, seems very contained. In fact, it's contained, it's about ready to explode.
Yes. Would you recommend going once or twice to the same play?
Perhaps to the same play. I would recommend going a number of different times. I know when I first started going to No plays, I would go without any knowledge of the story a lot of times. And so later people ask me, what play did you see? I don't know what play I saw. and I don't know the story. But after a while, I would just sort of let the music and the feeling and that sort of visual, those aesthetic qualities sort of flow over and sort of come out of it.
Very interesting indeed. So we needn't be frightened. Well, anyway, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, you were very active or very much involved in the production of At the Hawk's Well in Tokyo. And I see here we have the program of that production, haven't we? And could you tell us more about it, Rick, and what your involvement was?
Well, first of all, the play itself is a Yeats play, and Yeats had never been to Japan, had never seen No. He had only read translations of No. But for some reason, he was able to instinctively feel a certain, have an understanding for the progression of No, of how a story should progress. And so the poetry and the sort of the way the story is laid out fits very well with a No structure. And what we did, I composed music for that piece and then directed the piece. There were a number of foreigners involved who danced the main roles. And however, the music, the Hayashi instrumentalists were all Japanese professionals, except myself. I played the flute.
And what was the story about?
Well, the story was taken from Irish mythology, and the main actor, the main character, I should say, is a hawk, who is the guardian of a well, and it is her dance in the middle of the play which sort of gives it's sort of the highlight of the play, and the story sort of leads up to that point.
Now you mentioned the players. There were foreign players. Were they amateurs, professionals, or what?
The foreign players have all studied various aspects of Japanese traditional art, I should say. The main actor, actually she was an actress, she has studied both No and Nihonbuyo, and she's from Malaysia, but of Chinese background. And she brought to it sort of her sort of background too, and that is there were sort of Chinese elements of Tai Chi, which she also studies, and so it had that element to it, particularly in the dance.
Well, what sort of people came to see it?
Well, the people who came were about half Japanese and half foreign residents.
And what sort of response did you get?
Well, I think it was a very interesting response because many of the particularly Japanese who have seen No before, or even those who have never seen No before, sort of said it's not No-like. But it's not No. And so then people reacted to that's good, and some people thought, well, that's bad. And but I don't think they were criticizing the entire thing. In fact, the music was very No-like. Perhaps one person said, but there was so much movement. And that has to do with the misconception which I mentioned earlier, that No is supposed to be quiet. You don't have that much movement. But in fact, the very quick pieces were all from No. And there was that movement. There is that movement which exists in No.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, this particular place, should I say, adapted into Japanese, and it's called Takahime, and I understand it's quite well received here too.
Yes, it's been performed several times over the last, I'm not sure, about 10 or 15 years. And it's not performed as a part of the constant repertoire, but the person who wrote the play is my professor at Geidai, Yokomichi Mario. And then it was performed by professional No actors. And the structure is a little bit different from what we did. They rearranged the structure a little bit, but the story is basically the same. And, well, the development is basically the same, too, but it's not a direct translation. What we did was much more direct, much more faithful to Yeats' manuscript.
Well, interesting indeed.
Well, the symposium I mentioned earlier was entitled No in the World, which I suppose is very appropriate. In your case, Rick, was it No, because I know that you're interested in ethnic music as well, was it No that led you to that field too?
Well, I think they both were taking place simultaneously, and that is, I was studying about Asian music and Asian theater and Asian dance drama, sort of in general, and then I was doing No. I was in Japan, and I was doing No myself. And sort of that process of actually physically doing it, you learn to enjoy it very much. And so it was sort of, the two go hand in hand, but they, of course, influence each other.
You seem to have an immense number of irons in the fire, Rick.
Too many,
you are interested in Asian music and Asian theater, and I wonder how you find time to cope with it all.
Well, I think for what I am doing, that is sort of physically doing, that is performance-wise, it's very much in the No area. But one thing I'm trying to understand is more how sort of No fits in the general sort of Asian perspective.
Yes, well, I was going to ask you about your future plans. Anyway, we shall in a second. Obviously, No is not the only field in which there can be international exchange, although it's certainly a very important one. And I think it's a very good sign that people in London are seeing kabuki and in the United States, etc. So it's a very much cross-cultural program going on, and you are very much part of that, aren't you, Rick?
Perhaps. For better or for worse.
So you've been in Japan, you're still studying for your PhD. What does the future hold?
Well, first of all, I would like to perhaps compose some more music and direct perhaps another play in English using no music. We had many criticisms, but at the same time we had a lot of encouragement, and I would sort of like to continue that experiment. I'm not sure where it will lead. But that's sort of the performing, composing side of it. On the other hand, I'm also interested in studying more about no, of course as a performer, but also studying it as perhaps as a scholar or student and studying no from the, as I said before, the greater Asian perspective, I think. And so in a way it's those sort of three or two performing sort of that sort of scholarly activity, composing, which are sort of built up inside of me. I don't like to present myself as a scholar.
You're not just a scholar. You're a scholar, you're a performer, you're a director, you're a composer.
And whether that's good or not, I'm not sure.
Do you think you'll go back to the States someday?
I think that's a possibility, but I don't have that necessarily as an aim. I'm right now much more interested in going to other parts of Asia.
Well, as a man of action, he can never be held down, can he?
No.
Always on the move.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's been a revelation for me today, hearing a great deal more about No than I knew about before.
It was the same with me.
And I really must try, with all this information that you've given us today, Rick, to see a play, No play, and enjoy it.
I'll gladly take you sometime.
So until next time, thank you. It's goodbye from us all here.
Goodbye.
Bye.